This is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today I'm talking with famed neuroscientist Ruben Gur. Hi Ruben, how you doing?
Okay, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Ruben, tell us about how evolutionary science or evolutionary theory has informed your research.
Well, I think at this point it's almost impossible to pinpoint how it does specifically inform my research because it has become so much a part of the way I think that it's hard for me to separate. But it just, from the first time I heard of evolutionary theory and later on as I actually studied it more, I just began thinking that way, and I can't imagine thinking any other way. So from a simple situation where I discover a new effect in the data, I immediately say to myself, why is that good or why is that bad? If I see any effect that is shown by all the subjects, first question that comes to mind, what is the evolutionary advantage of having this effect in humans? Very early in my work, I came across sex differences, and at the time it was almost a taboo to look at sex differences. And in fact, we got quite a bit of grief at the beginning when we published the first finding of sex differences in blood flow, where it turned out that females had a higher rate of blood flow than males. That brought an onslaught of letters to science because people felt that any biological difference between males and females it can only be an excuse to perpetuate the social inequities. And we actually had to make the argument that sex difference doesn't necessarily mean that one sex is better than the other, that we enjoy the fact that oranges and apples are different and are not obsessed with the question of what is better, an orange or an apple. But as more and more sex differences popped up, and they popped out in our brain research to the point that we started saying if there is no sex difference, then it's probably not related to the brain. So, I mean, these were the two. At the time, we were trying to harness new technologies for studying the brain, and there will be a technology showing up, and we will try it out. And the first two questions we would ask: does it show age effects? And if it doesn't show age effects, it's probably not important and not related to brain function. And does it show sex differences? And if it doesn't show sex differences, it's probably not important and not related to brain function. And as the sex differences started piling up, and you try to make sense of those differences, the call of evolution kept ringing in our ear, and really. This, rightly or wrongly, this idea of the hunter-gatherer whose brain we are still carrying, that helps remember all the sex differences. If you want to remember what are functions that males are better at and what are functions that females are better at, you just need to imagine yourself the hunter-gatherer male in the in the savannah and the hunter-gatherer female in the savannah, and whatever will make his job easier is probably something that males do better, and whatever will make her life easier would be something that you will find females do better. So if you think cognitively, males do better at spatial tasks, at motor tasks, and some types of spatial reasoning tasks, and females will do better in memory, almost any type of memory. They'll do better at almost any type of emotion processing, affect recognition, affect expression. They'll do better in tasks that require language communication. So again, they're not better at all aspects of language, but they would have better verbal fluency and all those things that can be derived from evolutionary theory, at least that aspect of evolutionary theory. And I realize this is very simplistic and probably too easy, but the heuristic value is just so immense that it's hard for me to imagine life without evolutionary theory. And even non-psychological factors. For example, females live longer than males. And in humans, it's almost a decade. In other animals, it's the difference is less strong, and there were a couple of studies. I recall one of them in Science a few years ago, looking at the lifespan of male and female apes and lions. You may recall that study, and basically the idea is if you want to know how long a female of a species will live, you need to know roughly the age at menopause. We're talking about mammals. Mm-hmm. And add to it the number of the time it takes to raise a puppy till it can stand on its own feet.
Right.
If you want to know how long the male of the species will live, you just have to know the age at which the female will go into menopause.
Right. Right.
So these are all findings that really reek of evolutionary theory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about you do a lot of research on schizophrenics and schizophrenia. In fact, you have a schizophrenia research center there at the University of Pennsylvania. Tell us about your latest research on schizophrenia or any other interesting research that you've been working on that you want to share with us.
Schizophrenia turns out to be a complex brain disorder. We know it's a brain disorder because you could very easily and readily establish abnormalities in brain structure and function in these patients. But the question is what kind of a brain disorder it is. And our hope for years was that it will end up like a disorder like Huntington's disease, where you need to fish and find the gene that causes it, and once you have that gene, you'll be able at least to predict who is going to get it, and then you are already on your way to trying to develop intervention methods. It turned out that schizophrenia is not like Huntington's disease. And that turns out to be true for most diseases, not just psychiatric, but physical diseases. Our colleagues in cardiology and um, oncology and really all the other disciplines have gone through that same movie where they first tried to look for a gene that codes for a disease. And it works for some illnesses. Some illnesses are coded and expressed that way. But for the vast majority of illnesses, there is no gene that codes for them. And that shouldn't be surprising from the angle of evolution, because if there was a gene that would code for a very serious disease, then that gene eventually should have disappeared. Instead, what the genes are coding for are a variety of biochemical processes that, if they are overregulated or underregulated or overexpressed or underexpressed under specific conditions and in combination with other genes, they can give rise to a process that may eventuate in a disease. So we are no longer looking for a gene for heart disease. We're trying to understand the genetics of cholesterol, of blood pressure, of type A personality, sugar metabolism, smoking. All those things would have a very strong genetic basis. And if you have a gene that ends up giving you high cholesterol, and you have the set of genes that will end up giving you high blood pressure and obesity and type A personality, and you smoke, and you end up doing all those things, then for sure you'll be suffering from a heart disease by the time you reach 40. But you can have all those genes, and your lifestyle counters them. You exercise, you eat low cholesterol food, you don't put yourself in situations that are too stressful. You'll reach old age without having a heart disease, whereas your friend who has none of these genes and has a hoagie every day for lunch will end up with a heart disease.
So is the same?
Ends up looking more like heart disease than like Huntington's disease.
Okay. And is there a context in which an individual could possess these genes for schizophrenia and it maybe be adaptive?
This is
theoretical.
Yeah, theoretically, I think it's possible. Of course, there is some evidence for, it's not clear, but for some overexpression of genes that may lead to schizophrenia in highly gifted individuals. So, for example, that Einstein's son, Eduardo, suffered from schizophrenia. And we know the famous case of John Nash, although you would wonder if he didn't have schizophrenia, whether he would have not gone even further than he did.
Right.
So it's unlikely. Most of the patients that we see with schizophrenia are impaired. But for example, we are studying families now, and we can find a very high similarity between family members and patients in their neurocognitive profile. And we have had some strange cases. We have one I remember, the brother of a patient who has been really very ill and hospitalized for most of his life. And that brother is a successful lawyer. And he has exactly the same score on his memory test as his ill brother. So we asked him, hey, do do you know you had bad memory? And a big smile goes on his face, and he's, do I know if that I have bad memory? And he opens his attaché case, and it's filled with devices to help him with his lousy memory.
Wow.
So you can have apparently a very high genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia without actually having the illness. So I think we and others are now really doing studies on cholesterol and blood pressure rather than on schizophrenia. I don't mean literally cholesterol and blood pressure, but we are now taking dimensional continuous measures of traits that are usually cognitive traits. I mean cognitive broadly to also include emotion processing.
Of course.
And that's what we study. We study those traits in large populations. And we believe that from those traits, if we can have access to the genome of these individuals, we should be able to identify the genetic and environmental factors that can lead to what we call schizophrenia.
So now you mentioned something, and maybe I misunderstood you. So you're relating this variable cognitive profile to a cardiac or cardiologist measurement of cholesterol, or are you guys actually looking at those effects as well, nutritional effects? Because that's something I've become very interested in.
Okay, I brought up the cholesterol as an analogy.
Okay.
We are measuring the behavioral analog of cholesterol.
Gotcha.
It would be memory.
Right.
Now, this is not to say that cholesterol and blood pressure and those factors may not end up being important even in the pathophysiology of a disorder like schizophrenia. I'm now not ruling that out at all.
Right.
There may be a gene that genes they don't regulate exactly concepts that we carry in our mind or in our brains. They regulate biochemical processes that may have multiple effects depending on where they occur in the body. So I wouldn't preclude the possibility that a gene that has effect on cholesterol may also have an effect on behavior that may eventually lead to vulnerability to schizophrenia. But what I did mean in that statement was that we are measuring what are now called endophenotypes, which are continuous dimensional measures that we believe bring us closer to gene action than using some higher order categorical approaches that divide people into different illnesses. So we are thinking less and less, in the case of psychiatric illnesses, we are thinking less and less on DSM and thinking more on dimensions of behavior and how they can be impaired and how they can relate to each other and how under certain conditions they can end up with psychopathology that would be labeled as schizophrenia.
Right. Yeah, no, and I just want to make that clear for our listeners. I am curious about the link between cholesterol and diet and brain processes, as there's been some new data suggesting a link between, say, insulin receptor, insulin resistance, and diseases like Alzheimer's disease, and that's directly linked to diet. But we don't need to talk about that today. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm going to ask you about the general field of cognitive or clinical neuroscience. In your impression or your opinion, do you think that the average cognitive neuroscientist pays attention to the evolutionary perspective? I know you do, and I know that you and I have talked about it before. But do you think that the average run-of-the-mill cognitive neuroscience pays its due service to evolutionary theory?
Well, a lot of them were taught to uh, ignore or even denigrate evolutionary theory. Um, I think, like you and I, evolutionary theory is in our bloodstream, and that's not to be thinking that way. But my impression is that if you ask them, most of them will say, evolutionary what?
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I personally think that's a terrible route to go. I think we saw psychology do that as a young science, go astray from Darwin and James and into the hardcore behavioral paradigm, and now it's just coming back into this discipline of evolutionary psychology, which again takes a lot of flack. And I see in my own reading of the literature, cognitive neuroscience sort of making that same mistake, that not paying attention to the idea of asking the question that I really like the way we started this interview, which is when you get a data point or a finding and you ask the question, why does this exist, right? And that's the real evolutionary question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, Ruben, thank you very much for your time.
Sure, Steve.
What will happen is your video will now be processed by the magazine's team, and should be up on the website in maybe a week or two. When I get that, I'll send you the link.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you very much, and say hi to if you talk to Farzine, say hi to her for me and anyone else I might know around there.
Okay, will do.
Okay, see ya.
Take care.